The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of this station and/or Confederation College.
Alrighty, well, welcome back to Spirit Canoe here at Confederation College. It's a program dealing with Indigenous issues. My name is Bob Goujon, and on the program this evening have Patty Haidu, Executive Director of Shelter House here in Thunder Bay, and you've also made yourself a political candidate for the Federal Liberal Party.
That's correct.
So that's not very far away. That's just, one is assuming the writ will be dropped. They're talking October, I believe.
Well, there's legislation that the election has to happen by, I think it's October 12th. However, there's as many rumors as there are people about when the election will happen.
Yeah.
So we're just plowing ahead, assuming that is going to happen and getting ourselves ready.
So I wanted to talk first about Shelter House, and the you've been there for
nearly 3 years now.
Oh, okay. So maybe just the thumbnail sketch of how you came to be there. Where you kind of were before Shelter House. Where were you, so to speak?
I spent 9 years in public health with the Thunder Bay District Health Unit as a planner, and I was focusing my efforts on alcohol and substance use and prevention mainly, so in the health promotion prevention sort of branch. And about 6 years into my role with the Thunder Bay District Health Unit, we applied for a grant from the Health Canada group through the drug strategy program, and we were successful, and we were able to create a municipal drug strategy for the city of Thunder Bay in partnership with 31 agencies. Public health's always had that role of
being a coordinator,
collaborating. Yeah, so we've always had that role of collaboration, fostering collaboration in communities, and so I was successful in becoming the coordinator, and spent the next 3 years working with the community to come up with a strategy or a plan on how we could reduce the harms associated with substance use. And so that was really interesting work, and really I learned a tremendous amount about not just substance use, but all truly the foundations of health and wellness, and the things that are needed for recovery, and the things that help children thrive, and all the challenges of harm reduction, and an enforcement perspective, and how do we weave all that together.
Well, and one could imagine that given the many of us could have imagined, I guess, spending time in bureaucracies, how specialized they become and how disconnected they become. And so the problem almost, especially if there is the feeling as you're working that you're just working on a tiny slice of a much broader set of issues and there's no coordination between the various services that are being offered, that I could appreciate that coordination would be a big and important project in and of itself.
It really was, and I think when we did an evaluation at the very end with the stakeholders about how they felt the process went and what they would have changed or what they liked and that kind of thing. And one of the things, overwhelmingly, the respondents said that one of the best things that came out of the strategy, which was unanimously ratified by council, by the way, but was this opportunity to learn from each other. To have enforcement officers sitting in rooms with outreach workers who distribute safe injection supplies, and for them to understand the philosophy behind harm reduction, which isn't to, promote substance use, but rather to reduce infectious disease and connect with people that are in need, and hopefully move people along to services and supports that might help them. And so these conversations that happened were really pivotal, I think, in everybody's understanding, even from every perspective. I mean, it was really valuable for harm reduction workers to understand that enforcement officers work within a framework of legislation, and that the law is the law, and they don't have the flexibility to bend the law. That isn't how they're trained. That isn't how they're governed, and that there's certain criteria that they have to follow. And so there's this appreciation started to grow for people about how difficult their work was from their own perspective, and these relationships also started to form. So for myself, this is where I developed incredibly strong relationships with leaders across sectors, and that served me well in my role at Shelter House.
Well, and I went again. I guess I'm coming at from the teacherly perspective, because that's what I do. So, in a sense, when I hear you talk, and just obviously everybody in society can experience this. As I say, we've over the last couple of hundred years, there's been this drift to ever more narrowly specialized programs, projects, what people do. You go live in a cubicle and you have your well-defined job description and you work from that space. And it's incredibly, I think, for a lot of people, isolating. And if you imagine that somebody who's got a job description in an institution that has a narrow mandate, you're working on a slice that's affecting all sorts of people that you don't really know much about, as you say, the interconnection. So the idea, if that's a liability, and we've gone down this direction over the last 100 and some years, that we really have to maybe turn, including education and how services are delivered and how services agencies communicate with each other. So are those, again, coming from experience like that, is that part of what, you, as you said, you went to Shelter House after that?
Yeah, so we transitioned the drug strategy from the health unit to the municipality. And so I moved with the strategy to the municipality. Same public sector pension, but different organization, different culture, different objectives. And so I was working away, at the city to try and give this thing some wings, right? And make sure.
So Shelter House didn't exist?
Shelter House was there.
Okay.
I was not in that role yet. And then suddenly the executive director, who I'd worked with very closely on the drug strategy, decided that it was time for him to move on. And so he approached me to apply for the job. He had seen my work with the drug strategy. He knew that I was passionate about the folks that they served and a harm reduction approach, which is really important to Shelter House. And he asked me to apply. And it was a big decision because I was a public sector employee with a defined benefit plan for anyone who knows about pensions. That's the gold standard. And and I really was passionate about the work that I was doing, but it was very intriguing to have an opportunity to work in a completely different world. Shelter House is the administration offices are in the shelter, so you're not segregated from the population that you serve. And I also felt that the opportunity to lead a complex organization that had a social justice value, really, approach, was something that doesn't come along very often. So I applied, and I was a successful candidate, and I had some tremendous learning ahead of me, and so there we are.
So what's the if you, for want of a better expression, corporate mandate and structure? Like the Shelter House is.
Well, we're a nonprofit charitable organization, so we are not aligned with any bureaucracy, really. We receive funding. Our core funder is through the province, through the DSAB. The DSAB administers the money, but it's provincial money.
Department of?
Thunder Bay, District of Thunder Bay Social Services Administration Board. So they're the folks that also administer social assistance, and they have the responsibility.
So ultimately it's provincial money.
Right, it's provincial money, so it comes through the DSAB to Shelter House. And so that's some of the money that we receive, but not nearly.
But you will go to the city and...
So we get some municipal money, which we apply for. And then we also seek out money through foundations and donations and, charitable events and lottery tickets and you name it.
Right.
So we are really beholden only to ourselves. We're governed by a board of directors, and they're all volunteers. We do have an ex officio from the city, which is a person who's on our board from the city, but it doesn't have voting.
So the board is your connection to the community.
Yeah, the board is all community members with a passion for it, for the work, with various expertise. And they also make the governing decisions around strategy and direction for the organization. But they give me quite a bit of latitude as the executive director to run the organization.
So I grabbed some of the information off the website. So I'm just going to ask a few questions from there because it gives us a bit of a reference point. So this is just straight off the homepage. Shelter House provides short-term, for those people who may out there not be that familiar with what the mandate is.
Right.
Short-term relief to those in need of shelter, food, clothing, and access to resources to support their transition towards successful independent living. So shelter, food, clothing, that's pretty much the basics. So if you don't have that, that's in essence your client base is people who don't have
the
shelter, food,
of life. That's right. Yeah.
And the idea is to transition them to independent living.
Right, so that people are not in chronic state of homelessness. And then we have varying degrees of success with that. We have people that are homeless for a very short period of time. We have people that we feed, but they are independently housed and they are living on social assistance rates that are far too low to be able to pay rent and buy food. And then we have more chronic, relapsing kinds of situations of homelessness that are related to people that have severe mental illness that's untreated, or they may have severe addictions, or they may have, they don't have the supports that they need in the community to actually live independently. And so with folks like that, those are really the most challenging folks that we serve, and we see them far too often. And not because we don't care about them. I say far too often because clearly it's an evidence
Probably
of a
it's the
system
other way
that's
around.
broken. Yeah.
They're coming to you because
Oh,
they get some comfort
absolutely.
there.
I mean, we are a safe place. What I mean by far too often is it's just a symptom of a really broken system.
Well, this is, I guess, what I was thinking about, that when you talk about the coordination role you had in that previous, that in a sense you're seeing the folks who are slipping through all those specialized cracks. And to some extent, I gather that Shelter House is the house of last resort.
Oh,
Is that
absolutely.
fair to say?
Yeah. We're a low barrier shelter, which means that we accept people who are intoxicated and who are using substances. We try to say yes more than no. So we will accept a whole host of people that typically are not just homeless, they're placeless. They've been banned and barred from a number of public spaces, and they don't have, they can't access Victoriaville, for example, to warm up or those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's interesting. That I don't know if there's some reports of homeless people showing up in libraries, like in San Francisco. I don't know if you saw that
and
report.
ours too.
Yeah.
Our library too.
So which is really interesting because in one sense there's this municipal institution which had been built for a particular purpose and is becoming a very interesting, potentially transition space.
And struggling and doing, I think,
because obviously the librarians aren't necessarily trained or whatever, right? For this, they're trained for putting books on the shelves in the alphabetical order.
We just did a presentation to our library group on the issues of homelessness and on what Shelter House does and what we can and can't do, and a little bit around how to work with folks that are really struggling. And we're really working on that partnership, actually. So they did a really cool fundraiser for us where they had food for fines. So people who got library fines could pay in food, and they donated a whole bunch of food to Shelter House. So there's this growing relationship, really.
Well, and it just seems to me it's an interesting, potentially transitional public space because as I say, this is it. It's open, so people show up.
And they have the internet.
Right. So I guess it's just interesting to speculate on how that space might evolve beyond the traditional notion of a library, which is just for reading books. That it's now it could expand to be a wider service.
I mean, I wouldn't want to speculate for our particular library board, but I mean, for sure, that those are the issues that they're struggling with. Just as you mentioned,
there was a report. I think it was on CBC last night. It was San Francisco, and they had now a full-time social worker who was going around dealing with
Talking
the
to
folks
people
and figuring out what their needs were.
Yeah,
because their need wasn't necessarily to read a book.
No,
they had
but it's a public space that's accessible. Yeah,
right.
And as we make our public spaces less and less friendly for people that are in poverty and that are struggling. Of course, people will start using whatever space they can find.
Right.
And we see, homelessness prevention initiatives across the U.S. and to some degree in Canada as well, where we see our architecture being designed in a way that's inhospitable to people sleeping, right?
Right. Well, and it brings me to your mission statement, perhaps. Shelter House provides basic needs, dignity, and comfort to people living in poverty and stimulates action to address, and this is, I guess, the point I was getting to, the root causes of homelessness. I guess at this juncture, I'm going to bring in a reference to an economist. There's a fellow by the name of Robert Heilbroner, whose book I've read a few times, which is called The Making of Economic Society. And it's got all sorts. He's an economist. But there's one thing he said, which just is so simple and clear to me that I like to keep it in my mind as a reference point. It sort of ties in here. And he says every society has to deal with two issues: the production of wealth and the distribution of wealth. So what are the rules of the game for how you do that? And if the rules of the game for the production of wealth is such that you're not distributing it. I mean, what was Oxfam just reported in the last week that we're very close to the top 100% is going to control 50% of the planet. So the production of wealth the rules for the production of wealth are actually, arguably, some people would argue, creating the inequalities. So in other words, what's showing up at your door is the result of the rules being such that there are no. I mean, in other words, the fact that, I mean, on the one hand, it looks like Shelter House is there because it's trying to alleviate a problem, but it's alleviating a problem that society is systematically creating.
For sure.
That's
I mean,
my
homelessness
point.
is growing and growing and growing. We haven't seen a reduction in homelessness. It's not, our board isn't deciding what to do with all the empty space. That's not the conversations we're having. And I mean, I echo your concern, I think, on the growing disparity between,
Well, and
the shrinking of the middle class, the fact that there's an inequity that is driving people to, it's a strategy to sort of turn people who have nothing on each other, right? If they're not focused on the real problem and they're focused on
that it's their fault.
Right. And so that's part of the work, is to educate people that poverty, we have this myth of individualism in our country, right? And it starts from the moment you're born. I mean, how many of us have been told that we could become prime minister if we really just tried hard enough or whatever,
Right.
And so effort, of course, plays a role in our success or our failure, but far more birth circumstance plays a role. And people hate hearing that. I don't know why. Well, I have some theories, but people kind of hate hearing that. And so part of our role is to educate the community that people don't choose this life of poverty. People don't choose addiction and chronic illness and mental illness. But in fact, oftentimes the illness, whether it's mental, physical, spiritual, is a result of this incredible deprivation that people have experienced since they were born, before they were born, in utero many times. And so that's a real pivotal piece for us, is to work on that myth of individualism, which is so ingrained in the way we think as a culture in North America.
Well, and I guess for me to put it in what seems to me obvious and straightforward terms, we're an incredibly wealthy society. In other words, the production of wealth is not our problem. So when I read your mandate, which is to provide shelter, food, and clothing, we have no incapacity to put food, shelter, and clothing on every human being in Canada. We don't have. It's not a capacity problem.
No.
It's
a willing.
It's a distribution.
It's a political
It's going
will,
back to
actually.
the issue of, it's not the production side, it's the rules of distribution are such that these people are systematically being created.
Right.
And it's not likely to get any better because, again, kind of on in our modern technological society, the thing that people are talking about these days, whether it's in Davos, Switzerland, when the elites get together and they're all worried about the fact that we're going to have a wealth without workers because technology makes it so easy to produce stuff without people. We don't have the mechanism for distribution of wealth to people is not in place. You have to go to work, and if you don't have to go to work to produce wealth, because we don't need so many people to produce the wealth we are creating, then we have lots and lots of people who are unnecessary to the production process. So we have a distribution problem that's barreling down the road at us. And it seems to me, to some extent, that's what's likely showing up at your door.
Well, for sure, in its most extreme example,
Yes,
absolutely.
of course,
I mean,
yes.
it's I often say to people, if you really want to see the effects of really bad public policy, come and check out Shelter House, because that's where you see, at its most extreme dysfunction, all kinds of really bad public policy. I mean, just kind of getting back to the distribution problem. I mean, the other piece around that, though, is that I actually don't believe you can sustain that inequity forever. It's very expensive, these emergency solutions, even though, even though we've always got our hand out in terms of donations, there's an expense that people don't calculate. And partly, I think, there's been this flawed argument politically, in the media that we just don't have enough money to build houses and to take care of the poor and to have affordable, living, social assistance rates that allow people to live in a way that they can meet their needs. We just can't afford that. Well, in fact, to not do that is fiscally irresponsible. When it costs $130,000 a year for someone who's addicted and on the streets versus $30,000 in an extremely supportive transitional sort of living space, we're looking at the expenditure of $100,000 worth of resources to manage something that coincidentally is incredibly inhumane. So part of our challenge, I think, at Shelter House, and my challenge as an individual, is to shine a big spotlight on the fallacy of that argument, that it is fiscally irresponsible and morally irresponsible, both together. And that it isn't just a matter of, gee, wouldn't that be nice if we could afford it? Well, I think we can't afford to not do it. I think that we are looking at skyrocketing EMS costs, skyrocketing police costs, jails that are growing exponentially. These are all really, really expensive solutions to a pretty fixable problem, actually. An investment in affordable housing is a really great start, for example.
And it's,
but it's political will, right? It's about making the argument that this is an investment in communities that will help municipalities, it will help people, and it will help all these organizations that are struggling, to make ends meet. People are criticizing the Thunder Bay Police because they want to spend $2 million on radios that don't work anymore. I think actually that's a reasonable expense when you're trying to communicate throughout the community about what you're doing. But instead of focusing so much on these minuscule asks, look at, well, why are police budgets skyrocketing? Because they're being asked to do the work of social workers. And why is that? That's because there aren't any, spaces for people to actually live. We have a waiting list of somewhere in the range of 1,600 people.
And if somebody's sleeping on your front lawn, you don't phone the social worker.
Right. You can phone our program now if it's between 2 p.m. and 2 a.m. We have an outreach program. But, even that's a Band-Aid. It's a Band-Aid. Really it is.
Right, yes, of course.
And Band-Aids are more expensive, in the long run because you keep having to buy the Band-Aids, right? Let's take a look at the root cause.
Well, exactly.
Yeah. And so we've seen, since the 80s, this sort of decay of a commitment from a federal level to invest in the building blocks of a healthy community. We now see, Harper ending the health council, pulling the health dollars back from the provinces, things that we've come to rely on as Canadians as the foundations of healthy communities. No investment in affordable housing. In the 90s when they closed down all the mental institutions and there were promises that there would be all this support in the community, well, only some people got that support. And actually, the people that got the support, by and large, were people that had very loud voices and people around them that could advocate for them. The people that didn't have advocates are the people that we see. A girl died 2 weeks ago, 26 years old, an IQ of 65. Tell me how that's humane to put people that have really an intellectual disability on the street and ask them to survive. Likely had, FASD. Don't know because there was no diagnosis,
Right.
So to me, those are really, really short-sighted, expensive, shall we call them solutions? Band-Aids to problems that have, maybe at the outset some investment that's needed, but pay off in spades.
Right. Well, yes. I was thinking about this. Well, we hear a lot about balancing the budgets, right? As if this is the central concern of any public institution. And the thought that crossed my mind, 200 years ago, a plantation slave owner who's running a plantation, I'm assuming he could balance his budget. In other words, revenues and expenditures could be balanced. But isn't that beside the point? You're running a slave plantation. I guess my point is the central problem isn't whether you can balance your budget. Is are you creating a socially just community?
Well, I think, not to quote Justin Trudeau, but I actually think budgets will balance if you actually make the investments in the right places.
Right.
I don't have a problem with a balanced budget. I can't run a deficit forever at Shelter House, but I also I also think that there's ways that you can balance the budget by choosing what you invest in, right? Anytime you balance a budget, there's only two ways to do it. It's either cut expenditures or increase revenue. And the increased revenue we've already talked about, right? Around.
Well, but I guess this goes back to my point about the rules of distribution.
Right, and that's kind of where I'm going.
Right,
Yeah.
and so if you're struggling to balance your budget, it's because somebody else has decided to balance their budget at your expense, and so on and so forth, and up the line. And so it's not one isolated set of decisions, and so it really does require a community appreciation of the interconnected expenses. The
Absolutely.
idea anyways, so which really, I guess, in terms of the root causes of homelessness, and in Northern Ontario, we don't have to my mind, I guess we're now shifting into the political conversation, because that's the authority to make decisions about how the distribution happens.
Right.
So obviously you've made the decision to enter federal politics on the assumption, I gather, that some of those problems that you've been seeing, that you can participate in the solution by entering into the federal political system. Maybe just to get at it, because you said in terms of Shelter House that that the monies were primarily provincial.
Well, I mean, we receive a small little amount from the federal government, very small percentage of our budget, project-based, through the homelessness partnership strategy.
Right.
But I should tell you that the total allotment, which we receive annually right now, is $116,000. That's our piece of the pie.
Right.
So, I saw Minister Candice Bergen talking at the homelessness conference in Vancouver in the fall, and proudly announcing their commitment to this $42 million across Canada. But when you really slice and dice $42 million, what it looks like in a community like Thunder Bay is $116,000.
Right.
And I think that's the fallacy of these big announcements, is $42 million to the average Canadian who's not really, it's a news blip. It's 10 seconds, $42 million. That sounds like, good, we're spending $42 million on homelessness. Yeah, the reality is the math doesn't work out, right? It's not a lot of money. It's not enough to build anything. $116,000, we use it to offset some of the costs for our transitional house, and we're very grateful for it. Do not get me wrong. But from a perspective of investment in a solution, it's clearly not an investment in solution. So, yeah, I mean, my interest in federal politics is, obviously, I'm an optimist, so I mean you kind of have to be to do this do this work and
yes, of course.
keep your wits about you. But I'm also a pragmatic person, and I feel that I saw some changes happening with the Liberal Party, specifically talking about a national housing strategy. It's talking about the regulation and legalization of marijuana, drug policy, something I'm passionate about. Talking about the need for investment in the foundations of a healthy community, talking about the need to have provinces meet with the Prime Minister and talk about federal transfers. This is really important. These federal transfers are really, really important. To kind of restore the federal government's role as really laying down that foundation for healthy communities. And I know it all sounds very rhetorical and very sort of rah rah rah. But I actually have to have faith that there's a possibility in that, or else why do we do this work? Or else it's just
excuse me.
It's a little defeating if you're doing it over and over and over with no hope for a different outcome. So I thought, this is a good time. There's some popularity of this party under this new vision and this new leader, and the values fit, and I think I have a lot to contribute in terms of truly understanding the needs of the North, healthcare, jobs, housing, and being a pretty strong advocate for that.
Right. I guess my own inclination is to wonder if we need more political independence in some form, even though that's kind of, as we were discussing before the show, that's kind of the more speculative, less pragmatic,
right,
woolly visionary.
And maybe we do. I can't comment on that, because to me that's almost putting the cart before the horse. For me,
go ahead. Yeah,
perhaps not for the the academics and the sort of political movers and shakers that are perhaps not aligned with a major party. For me, I see the system as I see change as incremental, right? We talked earlier. I mean, I didn't come up with that idea myself. I'm blessed to have seen Ira Glaser present, former executive director of ACLU, at a conference that I was at, and when he talked about, the risk of measuring progress by the brevity of our own lives, social progress, I remember that always, because for me, change is incremental. Change in ourselves is incremental, So when I look at the opportunity to have a role in shaping this organization, which is the Liberal Party of Canada, I'm thrilled.
Right,
I went to candidate school. Sounds so silly, but I went to candidate school, and I met social justice lawyers and environmentalists and chiefs of First Nations and Indigenous lawyers and on and on and on, and really neat people. I met some really neat people. And of course, there were sort of 30% of the typical, politician as you imagine it. But 70% were not. And I think that's important to know. And one thing I know about organizations is you can't lead, if you have those kinds of numbers, it's pretty hard to be an autocratic leader, and I don't sense that from Justin Trudeau. I do sense that he's pulling in people to talk about really significant issues. So I have hope that there will be incremental change in our political system, but it's not going to change unless people like me step up and say, I want to be part of that process. Yeah.
Well, I guess maybe speaking, you mentioned chiefs in that. I guess one of the crucial elements, how many of the folks that show up at Shelter House do you think are First Nation? Roughly
80%. Yeah.
80%. So.
And what, they're like 18% of the population in this region.
So, I hear numbers like that, and I'm thinking, oh, there's colonialism at your door.
Absolutely.
So, and I guess that's the what comes to mind. There was, for example, the past week there was the cover of Maclean's magazine, Winnipeg, declared by
the most
Toronto,
racist city
Maclean magazine, and the most racist city in Canada. And so I brought this into my students in one of my classes, and I said, Winnipeg is not the most racist city in Canada. The two most racist cities in Canada are Ottawa and Toronto, because they're the ones who coordinated the ethnic cleansing project called Confederation that created the imbalance in resources and everything. So,
and continue to do so.
What's special about Winnipeg and places like Thunder Bay is that's where that project has visibly failed. These are not ethnically cleansed places. Ottawa and Toronto are. I lived for 30 years in Ottawa. They don't know anything about Indigenous peoples. And they have a completely different project, which is Canada's a multicultural country. We're just a country of immigrants, and that's their theory of government, right? So for me, I'm sort of assuming that to some extent that's what's showing up at your door is colonialism.
Absolutely.
So I guess I'm again, having spent 30, I can't see Ottawa transforming itself. That's so because its mandate, its reason for existing, is to keep the colonial project going. The rules of the game are they're in charge and they decide how things are distributed. And so they have no interest whatsoever, from my vantage point, in ever handing any of that. They're always going to be claiming it's our decision, it's our say.
What happens when the decision makers become
First Nation?
More and more representative of our communities?
Well, exactly. That's for sure. That's when something. But when that change takes place, when that, if you like, the balance of players change, and if you like, the demography of the players, what's it going to shift into? I can't imagine it's going to continue with. In other words, if First Nations start to have a critical mass, I'm assuming we're not going to stay inside the colonial story. I assume the story is going to transform.
This is where the journey is
yes,
unknown to me.
Yes, and no, I don't have the crystal ball.
And so I can't make any assumptions, but what I can tell you is that organizations, like I said earlier, are living, breathing things, and they are representative of the people that work in them and that lead them. There are a number, still not a tremendous number, but there are a number of Indigenous people running in this election. Hopefully they will be elected. We talked a little earlier about, before we started, about Joe Moses here locally becoming the first chamber president, Chamber of Commerce president in Canada. And just to go back to Ira Glasser, I mean, he talks about his work. He was very pivotal in the civil rights movement. And he said, when do you think that they started working to end slavery? And he said, the first day the first slave arrived.
Right, exactly.
And, hundreds of years later, they're still working. They still have very discriminatory laws.
Right. Well,
but change happens. And so, again, back to this whole conversation around, what it should look like in 100 years, I don't know, but I know what I can contribute, and I know that my intent for going into politics is sincere, and I know that I have Indigenous people cheering me on and supporting me, and I know that I have Indigenous partners, seeking nominations and running, and that affirms for me that there's hope.
Sure. Oh no, I'm not suggesting there's not hope. It's just what road is, which door is hope behind.
But this is a road that's available, right?
Yes,
this
absolutely.
is a road. There's a car on it.
That's right.
So I'm going to take the car.
Yeah. No. I totally appreciate the pragmatism and the realize that tomorrow morning we're trying to feed a few more people than we did yesterday.
For
and
sure.
That's part of the reality of the. But just to go back to the Glasser point and about the American, I mean. One of the things that strikes me is, and again, many people have commented, every 2 or 3, 4 years, the United States explodes, right? Whether it's Rodney King, whether it's what's happened in Ferguson, and see, my problem with the discussion of racism is that just makes it look like it's some sort of racial conflict, as opposed to, well, they had 200 years of slavery.
Yeah, a history of oppression.
And so if you've institutionalized slavery for 200 years, then what you're institutionalizing is the inequality of wealth, the inequality of culture, the inequality of political rights, all of that. And that's what it's really about, is this distribution of rights and wealth, that there are people who are benefiting and there are the people who are losing. And the people who are benefiting, okay, we can talk about it in terms of racism, but that's really not the issue. The issue is that there's a group of people who are trying to cling to their privileges, and that's what you're shift to the Canadian context. That's what you're seeing at your door, is the people who have been disadvantaged, and the folks who are the beneficiaries of the system. They're not letting go without a fight. They're going to use every resource they have at their disposal to defend, rationalize, and keep it going. So having put it in those terms, if you like, what form the political or economic or social solution might take, it seems to me we need to keep that in mind, that it's colonialism, not just racism, because colonialism is the cause of the racism, not the other way around, as far as I can tell. Because it's all about the beneficiaries and what your benefits are.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and I think anybody who disagrees with that, in terms of the nature of racism against Indigenous people and tries to disconnect colonialism from that conversation is maybe being disingenuous.
Well, but it's to somebody's advantage to portray it as just racism.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, colonialism, whether we like to talk about it or not, and some people don't, as you've pointed out, it is woven into the history of our country, and to right those wrongs. I mean, we need to embrace these opportunities to, seize on these moments of change. Right. One of the things that I think that we need to be having conversations about is investment in First Nations communities that don't have the very foundations that we all take for granted. I mean, when you think about, is it 10 communities in our region at least that haven't had running water for over 10 years, or not running water, but potable water for over 10 years. Right. Communities that are not connected to the grid and have to burn diesel 24 hours a day for, lights and
or
hydro.
Shoal Lake that's providing Winnipeg with water and they don't have any.
Right.
I mean,
these are, again,
that's pure colonialism as far as I can see. Again, the distribution of wealth and the claim of political rights.
And it doesn't do anybody any favors because, again, it's really short-sighted. I mean, it's not only fiscally ridiculous, it's inhumane.
Well, as I put the question to Georgianne Morisseau when she was here, which was, if the folks down in Ottawa and Toronto who claim their authority on the basis of a monarch living in another country, that's their claim to authority. That's what it rests on. If they can collect taxes in First Nations territories, why can't First Nations collect taxes in First Nations territories? I'm not talking about reserves. I mean in their traditional territory. So if a company comes in, if settlers come in, they pay a tax, and it goes to First Nations. That's the problem. But Ottawa is never going to buy that version of the story because they claim the sole and exclusive right.
But maybe it's looking at it a different way. I mean, maybe it's looking at, corporations that sort of want the benefit of using the land, whether it's to transport their goods or whether it's to, investing back into those communities fiscally.
Right. But it's not charity.
Oh no, I don't mean through a charitable model.
No, but that's the mentality.
No,
I don't
we're
giving these poor people something, as opposed to we're paying the rent.
I think we need to see that there's benefits to the communities that are contributing to the wealth, the making of the wealth.
Yeah, it's their wealth.
Yeah. So.
It's their land. That's what the treaties were all. What the treaties recognize, above all else, land belonged to First Nations peoples. That's why the Canadian and British had to do treaties. The treaties are the claim that we have the authority, that is Ottawa, Toronto, to take stuff.
Right. I think what I think I see in people like Joe Moses is this amazing, just this really a neat way of talking about the benefits of collaboration. We're kind of back to where we started,
sure,
right?
Yes,
We're back to where we started, where all good stuff happens when you work together,
right,
rather than when you're working from a very conflicted perspective. And I hear what you're saying in terms of the system being colonial. But I think I have to have hope that things are changing, or else why am I doing what I'm doing?
What you were just suggesting with, what's his first name?
Joe
Moses. That if enough Indigenous peoples with an Indigenous perspective who have a different model of collaboration, if you like, culturally speaking, come into the colonial system, that the conflictual, if you like, colonized versus colonizer relationship is going to transform itself without just flipping, if you like. It'll actually be transformed.
Well, we're growing, and that's the thing. I mean, one of the things that I said to Justin Trudeau the first time I talked to him is I said, oh my gosh, supposing you're elected and I'm elected, how are we going to undo everything that was done during the Harper regime? And he said to me, and here's where I really started to understand the depth of his thinking. He said to me, actually, that's the wrong way to think. It's not about undoing things. It's about creating beneficial policy. So it's not good enough to go back to what we had, because what we had was broken anyway. Let's move forward and develop policy together that works for people. And that's the way I look at this relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, is that I think going backwards is never going to happen. Nothing in life happens that way. You can never go back to what you had before. Right. But you can find a new way. You can find a way of partnership. You can find a way of mutual collaboration. And I think that's what Joe was saying last night, is that we're in a new era. You could feel it in the room. With an entire table bought for DFC business students at the Chamber of Commerce AGM. These are, they may not seem monumental.
Oh, no,
They are extremely monumental.
No, even in the classroom, my optimism is, I would express it as, the kids are coming.
The kids are coming. They're growing up. They're becoming educated. They're taking advantage of the tools that are in front of them, and the conversations are changing. And not only that, but someone else said to me once that progress happens. I think it may have been Cynthia. Progress happens one death at a time, because honestly,
the attrition process.
It's sort of as the old guard, who oftentimes are not flexible. I'm not saying always, but oftentimes are not flexible in their thinking. As they move out of the way and the younger generation comes forward, there is an opportunity for a new dialogue. I mean, look at me. I'm old compared to these, young people in this institution, but I am still relatively young. I mean, I'm 48, right? So I have a different philosophy.
Oh, good, you are young.
Yeah, I know, the gray hair, it fools everyone. I do have a different philosophy than the 65-year-olds. For sure. I was educated differently. I had different experiences. I had different relationships. By the time I was in post-secondary school, there were First Nation people. Not as many as are now, but there were. And so I was able to develop friendships. I had a partner who was from a First Nation community. So I've had a completely different experience than the 65-year-old who, at that time, most of those people were in residential schools, right? So I believe that there is hope to travel together more and more. And as we become, like the two-row wampum, traveling the same direction and occasionally, crossing over, we're going to see.
Well, there's a two-row wampum and there's a covenant chain. So the two-row wampum, as I tend to describe the principle of non-interference. I'm not the only person. The principle of non-interference. But then there's a covenant chain when you get together and you do stuff to joint projects.
So maybe that's a better example. But
well, no, they're both of them. Because the two-row wampum is the example of the self-government and sovereignty.
Right.
That's not to be compromised.
Right.
There's nothing in the interpretation of the treaties as extinguishment and surrender.
Yeah.
That's not what, in my understanding, Indigenous peoples were coming to protect their rights. They weren't coming to give them away. So, in a sense, anyways, there's some. I tend to agree. I tend to be on the optimistic. It's just what form the optimism is going to take, and to be prepared for it when it comes.
Who has a magic crystal ball? No. I don't. I only know what I can contribute, and what I can contribute is integrity in my relationships, and I have good relationships with Indigenous people across the community.
Right. So
that's what I
assume that you on election day you are successful. Let's assume that in other words, we'll pretend we're staring into the crystal ball.
Pretend that I get there. That's right,
anyway, well, just so what would you be? Have you been thinking? Oh, gee, if I could, I would do this.
Well, I mean, the areas that I know the most about actually are drug policy and housing. And so I know that the Liberal Party has talked about both. They've talked about the regulation of marijuana, which is a no-brainer since our neighbors to the south who set the tone about drug policy are on the path.
Unbelievable as it is. I thought we were the cool kids on the continent.
Not anymore. It's embarrassing going to those international conferences, let me tell you, as a Canadian, and it wasn't always that way. So that's a no-brainer. And so there's examples across the world of how to do it well and how to do it in a way that protects the most citizens and, and generates revenue and allows for sort of a safe transition to that, right? So I would love to be involved with that. I would love to be involved with a national housing strategy. I think that's another thing that
So what would that, just in terms of, because it sounds like a phrase, but people might not.
Well,
what do you think
a strategic
national
plan about how we're going to increase affordable housing in the country. What are we going to do about this housing problem? And how are we going to go about doing it? And what are the needs? Because it sounds really simple. Like, let's just build some houses then. Doesn't that sound so simple? But there really is a range of housing that's needed, from highly intensive supportive to, fully independent sort of subsidized units. And I think it would be really interesting to be involved in that conversation and make sure that the needs of the North and the needs of the remote communities and the needs of people that are struggling with other issues are represented in that strategy.
Right.
Like you said, you don't want Toronto and Ottawa controlling the entire strategy.
This is it.
You want people that have had direct hands-on experience in these
and understand
things.
that this isn't Toronto.
So those would be sort of two, if I could pick projects to work on, I for sure would want to pick.
Well, it was interesting.
Projects.
There was, again, I tend to be a CBC watcher, so there was a story last night, I think it was about a city in Brazil, and again, dealing with the idea of moving. Or they were basically talking about the question of whether our cities had become unworkable. And back in the 50s, they were built because of the automobile to presume that, so built all these roads, and commuters were out here, and that is living out here and going to work there, and created these societies that making us fat and unhealthy and all these, right? And now starting to think
and now we're trying to build bike lanes to do some of that, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, and I think it is necessary to understand how we got there. I mean, what were the drivers? Well, obviously the economic interests of certain developers and so on, who were leading the way and saying, well,
And an oil-rich economy where burning oil was not seen as necessarily harmful or unsustainable. I mean, there were a whole bunch of drivers, for sure.
So understanding, putting that on the table. And again, I think the idea of a more coordinated. In other words, one group of people don't drive the story, and trying to keep the conversation fairly wide, and the participants wide, and thus, I guess, maybe to close in on the issue of media, because that's one of the issues that I'm interested in. As I say, watching that story of Winnipeg unfolding and Toronto telling the story, essentially. And so they're basically framing Winnipeg, as I say, as the most racist city in Canada. Well, that depends on who's telling the story and from what perspective you're telling it. They may, as I say, just be the most visible example of the failed project that Toronto and Ottawa represent. So that idea of being able to tell your own story and having your own platform to do it with, I don't know. I'm sort of curious because you were talking when you were talking about that coordination, and it's really a communications
absolutely
issue.
I mean, I learned a lot of what I know about media and public health, and I had an amazing mentor who was my manager at the time, and I mean, so she taught me quite a bit about media interviews and that kind of thing. But I think the bigger picture is, for me, is getting out in front and telling the stories. One of the things that's been very successful back to Shelter House has been the columns that I write for the Chronicle Journal. And I've had incredible feedback on those columns that I had to write them because I had to tell these stories, especially in the early days when there's a real difference between studying poverty and being a bureaucrat and then actually talking to people who are living in dire poverty, who are hurting and wounded. And so there's a period of acclimation that happens when that happens, when you are a newcomer to any community. And so I was a newcomer to the community of homelessness.
Right.
And it was humbling and horrifying, and it was beautiful, and it was tragic, and so much happened. And so I started to write these stories because I thought, if only people knew, if only we could stop that narrative that this person is choosing this life, that this person has made a bad choice, that this person isn't trying hard enough, that this person deserves what they get. You know, some of the really nasty dialogue that you hear when you read the comments under an online story. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the ways that we can utilize media to our advantage. So I wrote, and I'm a good writer, I'm blessed with that skill, so I wrote the first column. And it was actually a letter to the editor. And I sent it off to the editorial page, and Ian Pattison, who's the editorial manager, said, "This is fantastic. Wow, thank you so much." And they got a whole bunch of hits, and people wrote to me and called me and said, "We want more." So I asked him if he would be interested in doing a series, and he agreed that we would. And so we did a 8-part series where we highlighted different stories and different realities at Shelter House, and we were able to weave in our own dialogue, not just tell the story, but also talk about the value of harm reduction, and also talk about, public health and housing as a foundation, and all of the social health theory, but in a really accessible way to people. And so I think that savvy politicians and savvy social justice workers and, savvy people who want to make a difference can find outlets like that.
Right. Well, obviously the internet has made communication widely accessible.
Double-edged sword, though.
Pardon me?
Double-edged sword, though.
Yes, because it's dispersed. We become dispersed in another way. Everybody has their website for
But
whatever.
there's also incredibly nasty dialogue that happens on a regular basis that I think perpetuates stigma and discrimination. I mean, look at what happened municipally.
Right.
Pretty scary times, right? How did that spread? That spread through, largely through social media and giving a platform to hatred, right?
Sure. Any thoughts on the antidote? And by antidote, I simply mean, well, I guess I don't know. I sometimes refer to the opportunity. I was actually out the law department had a conference, and I had a few of them on after the conference. Students and Karen Drake were on, and I guess I used the expression because I was sort of, just as you were kind of describing when you found yourselves in amidst a group of people who were kind of like-minded and so on. And I just sort of, when I was there, and Ovid Mercredi was there was all sorts of people at this conference, and I said, well, it's kind of like a culture of allies, right? And so it's the idea of a platform for those. I mean, on the one hand, as I say, that there's for those cultural allies to work together in an effective way to find.
So the other thing that I've done throughout my career, and I mean, part of my recognizability, which is pretty high, is that I am shameless about taking every media opportunity.
Right.
Because you can actually tell a story every single time. If someone calls me because, they want to talk about methadone, I'm happy to talk about methadone, and let's talk about, the value of harm reduction and the value of replacement therapy and why does it exist and that it's a best practice in Canada and et cetera, et cetera. So I see that those opportunities as a way to frame a narrative, right? And again, it's process. It's not you're not going to get it all out in one story,
right.
And you're not going to convince everybody this time. But our donations are up 25% this year, and we haven't done anything all that tremendously special. And I think it's the constant appearance in Shelter House, the constant messaging, and I don't want to take full credit for it, but I mean, I think we've really elevated our public presence, as an ally, as advocates, as educators. Oftentimes, the media will come to me first about a substance use issue, about the need for recently ID and storage, and why is that important? And, hey, Patty, what do you think about this panel on homelessness? And anytime they ask, I answer. Because there's an opportunity, even if it's a 10-second sort of spot on TV, to get out there and say, hey, by the way, this is actually fiscally more responsible, and it's the right thing to do, and to sell our message over and over and over. And then the other piece is the pragmatic piece, right? You don't convince people on a social justice argument. Not all people.
Right.
I mean, people like
my,
you, I
my
could probably
slave
convince
argument,
you, right?
My slave example doesn't work for everybody.
Anyone almost, really.
Yeah.
Certainly not decision makers and certainly not funders. What convinces them is evidence and data and constantly hammering away at the value to the entire community. This is the public health theory, right? Public health didn't start as some feel-good piece about how we should, elevate the health of the poor. I mean, true sort of initiatives around let's not have the raw sewage running down the poor neighborhoods wasn't driven by because that's really gross for them and they shouldn't have to live like that. It was driven by because we're all getting sick. Oh my God, the middle class is getting sick and the autocrats are getting sick. And so I think we can learn from public health that what's good for the people that are living in poverty is good for all of us. That a healthy community depends on all of us being healthy. And there is the pragmatic piece. You have to know your audience, right? You make the argument that you need to make when you're in front of an audience of funders and bureaucrats and people that honestly the social justice argument is not going to carry any weight, and doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means that's not the primary lens that they look at it from.
Right.
Then don't make that argument. Save it for the end.
Right.
And I do that. I mean, I say, here's the fiscal reality. This is what you're spending this way. This is what we actually alleviate. This is how your services will be able, if the EMS isn't picking up an intoxicated person, they can actually respond to a heart attack. So we'll take the intoxicated people and give us a little money to do that. And you handle the heart attack, which you're really good at. And by the way, it's the right thing to do.
Right.
And that's been, I wouldn't say it's 100% effective all the time.
That's the working strategy.
But that's the strategy. The strategy is we need to demonstrate our value to this community because we don't just do this for the people that we serve. Clearly, we're compassionate and we care about those people and we want people to not suffer. But we also do it because we're invested in the wellness of this community. And we are just as pivotal as lights and transportation and sewage and, the transit system and snow clearing and all of that. If you don't take care of the people that are the most at need, then all of us suffer. And that is public health theory. It's like 101,
Right.
And so, yeah, I'm pragmatic about it. And I use the argument that I think that needs to be used for the audience that I'm speaking to because at the end of the day, we work within the system that we have, and we try to make these incremental changes, and we try to push people a little bit outside of their comfort zones, and we try to encourage people to think about things through different lenses. But if you slam the hammer down, nothing happens. If you insult people and tell them that they're colonialists and that they
Right, yes.
clearly don't
no,
understand.
That's right. I can get away with that in the classroom. It's
But
true.
you can't get away with that in real life. Not leading an organization that depends on donations, not governing a country that depends on people supporting you, either voting for you or donating to you or whatever. And so you have to be pragmatic in this work. But it doesn't mean that the work isn't valuable. What it means is that it's slow, right? But it's valuable. And when I'm done and I'm burnt out, I'll pass the torch to one of these young guys, and they're going to take the torch, and they're going to change it in even a better way. And that's kind of how stuff happens.
Right.
That's my philosophy anyway.
Sounds pretty good. Anyways, we're out of time.
All right, well, that
At
was
least
fun.
on this, yeah, it was. Thank you. So Patty Haidu, Executive Director of Shelter House here in Thunder Bay, and newly minted candidate for the Liberal Party in the federal election coming up.
That's right.
Whenever. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Alrighty. So this has been Spirit Canoe. Thank you, wherever you are, or they're over there. All right. Looking for the lights. Take it away, Katie.